Hey friends, welcome to Unpolished by Cult. I'm Kathrin Shaffer, and today we're stepping into one of those conversations that feels a little like opening a drawer we all know is messy, but keep pretending isn't. Not because we're hiding anything dramatic, but because the things inside are subtle, easy to overlook, to live with for a long time without realizing how much they shape the way we think and feel. Most of us don't walk around with loud, obvious misconceptions about God. It's not like we sat down one day and decided to believe something untrue. Instead, we've picked up quite quiet assumptions along the way, little interpretations that formed through experience, through disappointment, through comparison, through trying to make sense of life as we went. And over time, those assumptions start sounding like truth in our own heads. We might not say it loud, God is disappointed in me, but we feel that low hum of pressure when we think about our spiritual life. We might not consciously believe we have to earn closeness, but we notice we feel more comfortable praying when we've had a good week than when we haven't. We might not declare that we're behind, but there's this subtle sense that we should be further along by now. These aren't loud lies. They're quiet distortions. And because they're quiet, they can shape our relationship with God without us ever stopping to question them. So today, we're not coming in with a checklist or trying to fix everything in one sitting. We're just slowing down together and noticing the stories we've been carrying, the ones that influence how we approach God, how we interpret our own growth, and how we see ourselves when things don't feel as steady as we'd like. Because once we can name these narratives, they lose some of their power. And clarity, even gentle clarity, is where freedom starts to grow. All right, so let's pull up a chair and talk about the subtle lies we sometimes live with without even realizing it. So there's something fascinating about how beliefs actually form in us. Most of them don't arrive with a formal introduction. They don't knock on the door and announce, "We're going to shape how you see the world." No, they slip in quietly through repeated experiences, through moments that left an emotional imprint, through the conclusions we draw when we were just trying to make sense of what was happening around us. And before we know it, those conclusions start to feel like facts. Our understanding of God often develops the same way, not just from what we read or hear, but from the way life itself felt, from how approval worked in our homes, schools, friendships, from how we experienced authority, from moments when we felt safe and moments when we felt alone. And all of that quietly informs the lens through which we interpret God's character. The tricky part is that lens can be slightly tilted without us noticing. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously off, just enough to change the tone of the relationship. Enough to make faith feel a little heavier, a little bit more performance-based, maybe a little less restful than it was meant to be. One of the most common distortions we tend to carry is the subtle sense that God is, at baseline, disappointed. Not furious or distant in an obvious way, just quietly unimpressed, like there's a version of us we're supposed to be and we haven't quite reached it yet. And what's interesting is how normal that feeling can seem. It blends so easily into our spiritual vocabulary. We might interpret it as conviction or humility or desire to grow. But if we pause and really listen, sometimes it's just this underlying sense that we're not quite measuring up. We see it in the way we react to small things. When we miss a few days of prayer and feel like we need to get back on track, as if something slipped relationally. When we have a messy week emotionally and feel hesitant to show up honestly, like we should tidy ourselves first. When we make a mistake and our instinct is to shrink back instead of lean in. Those reactions don't come out of nowhere. They come from the very human habit of projecting our experiences with approval onto God. If love or acceptance in our lives has ever felt tied to performance, it makes sense that we'd assume divine acceptance works similarly. Our brains are wired to recognize patterns, and we tend to map the familiar onto what we don't fully understand. But that subtle belief shifts the emotional posture of our faith. Instead of approaching God with openness, we approach Him with a hint of self-consciousness. Instead of warmth, there's caution. Instead of resting in relationship, there's this quiet sense of needing to prove something. We begin to filter ourselves without realizing it. We soften our doubts before we voice them. We shape our prayers to sound more composed. We highlight the good parts of our lives and minimize the messy ones. And over time, the relationship can start to feel slightly formal, like we're trying to maintain a certain impression. That's not rebellion, that's instinct. But it creates a kind of distance that was never actually required. Right alongside that belief often sits another quiet narrative. The sense that we should be further along by now. And this one feels almost responsible, like it belongs in the category of maturity. But when we slow down, we can hear the pressure underneath it. It's often fueled by comparison, not just with other people, but with an imagined version of ourselves who has everything figured out. That imaginary version of us is consistent, patient, grounded. They don't struggle with the same habits twice. They don't circle back to old fears. They don't have days where faith feels ordinary or quiet. And every time we notice we're not that version, there's a subtle frustration like we've fallen behind in a race no one actually mapped out. But growth rarely unfolds in straight lines. Real change looks more like a winding path. We revisit the same lessons from new angles. We grow in awareness, then forget, then remember again with more depth. We don't graduate from being human. We just deepen in understanding. When we believe we should be further along, it becomes harder to see progress. Instead of noticing how far we've come, we focus on the gap between where we are and where we think we should be. Gratitude gets replaced with impatience. Curiosity gets replaced with quiet frustration. It's like standing halfway up a mountain and only looking at the summit, forgetting to turn around and see the miles already behind us. That belief creates a subtle tension in our relationship with God. It makes faith feel like something we're constantly catching up in, rather than something we're living within. And when that pressure sits in the background, it's hard to feel at ease. And then there's another layer, maybe the most deeply rooted one of all. The idea that closeness with God is something we earn. This belief is so embedded in how the world works that it almost feels natural. Effort leads to reward. Discipline leads to access. So we instinctively assume the same dynamic applies spiritually. We notice it in how we feel more confident approaching God after a good week. and more hesitant after a hard one. We notice it in how spiritual practices can start to feel like transactions. If we do this, we'll feel closer. If we don't, maybe we won't. It's subtle, but it turns relationship into a performance loop. Instead of closeness being the starting point, it becomes the outcome. Instead of connection fueling growth, growth becomes the prerequisite for connection. And that shift is exhausting because it keeps the focus on self-evaluation. Are we doing enough? Are we consistent enough? Are we in a good enough place? Living with that mindset creates a quiet anxiety. Because if closeness is earned, it can also be lost. If it depends on performance, it fluctuates with our worst weeks. And that's a heavy way to carry faith. What's fascinating is how these distortions rarely present themselves as bold beliefs. They show up as feelings, instincts, interpretations. We might not say God is distant, but we feel distant and assume the feeling must reflect reality. We might not declare we're failing spiritually, but there's this quiet sense of not quite being where we're supposed to be. Feelings are persuasive like that. They feel like evidence, even when they're just information. And this is where awareness becomes so powerful. When we start paying attention to the emotional undertone of our faith, we begin to notice patterns. We notice how often we assume disappointment instead of patience. How often we interpret delay as disapproval. We equate emotional intensity with closeness. Noticing doesn't mean criticizing ourselves. It just means observing. It's like realizing we've been looking through slightly tinted glasses. We don't panic, we just take them off and see what the color actually looks like. Most of these beliefs formed honestly. They are our best attempts to interpret life. But just because something feels familiar doesn't mean it's accurate. And when we begin to question these assumptions, we create room for a different kind of relationship with God. One that feels less pressured, less performative, more grounded in reality instead of interpretation. That shift doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds slowly through moments of noticing, catching a thought midstream and asking, is this actually true or is it just familiar? And that's the invitation of this episode. Not to overhaul everything, not to leave with perfectly tidy beliefs, just to start noticing the quiet narratives that have been shaping how we see God without us even realizing it. Because once we can see them, they don't get to operate in the background unchecked. And that's where freedom begins, not in perfection, but in clarity. Once we start noticing these quiet narratives, something shifts almost immediately. Not because everything suddenly becomes crystal clear, but because we're no longer being carried along by assumptions we didn't even realize were steering us. It's a bit like realizing there's been a background music playing the whole time. The song doesn't stop right away, but now we hear it, and that changes how it affects us. Awareness creates breathing room. We begin to pause when those familiar thoughts surface. The ones that whisper that God must be frustrated with us, or that we're falling short, that we need to get it together before we can feel close again. Instead of automatically agreeing with those thoughts, we start getting curious about them. We start asking where they came from and whether they actually reflect who God is or just how we've learned to interpret life. Because when we look honestly, we realize most of these ideas didn't form in a vacuum. They formed at the intersection of our experiences and our attempts to make sense of them. If approval in our lives often felt conditional, it makes sense we'd assume closeness with God works that way too. If we tend to be reflective or self-aware, it's easy for that awareness to tilt into self-critique. If we spent years trying to grow or improve, we might carry timelines we never consciously agreed to. So letting go of these distortions isn't about pretending they never made sense. It's about recognizing that they were interpretations, not truth carved in stone. And as we see more clearly, we're allowed to update the story. Take that belief that God is disappointed. When we slow down and examine it, we might notice it tends to surface most when we're already feeling vulnerable. After a week where we feel off, after a moment we wish we'd handled differently, after a stretch where motivation feels low and we're just going through the motions, in those moments our minds naturally try to interpret the feeling. And if disappointment is the narrative we've been carrying, it fills in the blanks automatically. We assume the distance we feel emotionally must reflect God's posture towards us. But feelings aren't always reliable interpreters. They're signals, not conclusions. When we begin separating what we feel from what we assume, something opens up. We can feel off without assuming God is distant. We can feel tired without deciding we're failing. We can feel quiet inside without believing the relationship has grown cold. And that shift changes the tone of our faith in a way that's hard to overstate. Instead of approaching God like we need to prove we still belong, we start approaching like we're already known. The conversation becomes less guarded. The honesty comes quicker. We don't feel like we have to edit ourselves before showing up. It's a subtle freedom, but it's real. The same softening happens with that persistent thought that we should be further along. Once we start paying attention, we notice how often it shows up in comparison moment. We hear someone else's story or reflect on our own patterns. And there's that familiar internal sigh, like we're missing a step everyone else somehow found. But when we look closer, we begin to see how unrealistic that expectation actually is. Growth has never been linear. It's layered. We learn something, then relearn it with more depth. We respond well one day and poorly the next. We circle back to old fears, but we notice them faster than we used to. None of that cancels progress. It just reflects the reality of being human. When we shift how we measure growth, everything looks different. Instead of looking for perfection, we start looking for awareness. We notice that we pause more often before reacting. We recognize patterns sooner. We recover more quickly from hard moments. We extend more grace than we once did. Those shifts might not feel dramatic, but they're evidence of real change. And when we start recognizing that progress, frustration begins to soften into patience. We stop treating ourselves like projects that are behind schedule and start treating ourselves like people who are in process. And when that pressure lifts, growth becomes more sustainable because it's no longer fueled by anxiety, but by openness. Then there's that belief that closeness with God is something we earn. As we become aware of it, we start to notice how often it influences our instincts. We feel more confident approaching God when we've had a good week, and more hesitant when we haven't. We feel more ready to pray when we're emotionally steady, and more awkward when we feel scattered. That subtle evaluation shapes the emotional climate of our faith. It keeps us slightly self-conscious, aware of how we're doing. But when we begin experimenting with showing up without that filter, approaching God on an off day with the same openness as on a good day, something shifts internally. The relationship feels steadier, less fragile, less like something that depends on us maintaining it perfectly. And that steadiness changes everything. Faith starts to feel less like something we're holding together and more like something that's holding us. Instead of striving to maintain closeness, we begin to live within it. Instead of calculating where we stand, we begin to trust that the relationship is secure. There's a quiet reorientation that happens as these distortions lose their grip. Our focus shifts away from constant self-evaluation and toward trust in God's character. We move from trying to manage the relationship to simply participating in it. That doesn't mean growth stops. It just means growth is no longer driven by fear. It's driven by desire. And an effort that comes from desire feels very different than effort that comes from pressure. Over time, this shift spills into the rest of our lives. As said, we become less reactive because we're not carrying the same weight of needing to prove ourselves. We do become more patient because we're not rushing our own growth. We become more compassionate because we recognize how much grace we've needed along the way. And perhaps the most noticeable change is the sense of steadiness that begins to replace that low-level pressure we might not have even realized we were carrying. There's a lightness in realizing God's presence isn't fragile, that it doesn't hinge on our perfect consistency or emotional state, that it remains steady even when we don't feel steady. And that realization doesn't make us complacent. It makes us secure. Security is fertile ground for growth. When we're not operating from fear, we're more open to change. When we're willing to be honest, we're less defensive. And those qualities create space for deeper transformation than pressure ever could. This is what it looks like when subtle lies get replaced with quiet truth. Not dramatic shifts overnight, not sudden perfection, just a gradual change in how we relate to God, to ourselves, to the process of becoming. We begin to notice the difference between familiar thoughts and accurate ones. And each time we gently choose clarity over assumption, we reinforce a new way of seeing. And that's how transformation usually happens. Not in one big moment, but in a series of small recognitions that slowly reshape the landscape of our inner world. So maybe the invitation here is simple: to pay attention to the tone of our inner dialogue when we think about God, to notice whether it carries pressure or patience, distance or openness. And when we catch one of those old narratives, to gently hold it up to what we now see more clearly. Because when the tone shifts from striving to trust, everything feels different. Not easier in the sense that life stops being hard, but steadier in the sense that we're no longer carrying an extra weight that was never ours to carry. So, friends, if this conversation felt familiar, that's okay. Most of us have carried at least one of these quiet assumptions without realizing it, and just noticing them is already a step forward towards freedom. We don't have to untangle everything overnight. Awareness itself is movement. Each time we catch one of these thoughts and pause, instead of agreeing with it, we loosen its grip a little more. So as we move through the rest of this week, maybe we just pay attention to the tone of our thoughts about God. Whether they sound like pressure or patience, or do they create distance or invite openness? And when we notice those old narratives, we gently remind ourselves that we're allowed to see more clearly now. So if this episode put words to something we've been feeling quietly, it might help someone else too. And if we want to keep supporting this space, so these honest, unpolished conversations can keep happening, all the links and resources are waiting in the show notes. Thanks for sitting in this conversation together, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks, friends.